Some families on Mexico's Pacific coast carry a small, genuine trace of Filipino DNA, carried 9,000 miles across the ocean by Spanish trade ships centuries ago. It has nothing to do with Spain and nothing to do with the Aztec or Maya bloodlines most people assume explain Mexican ancestry. This is not every Mexican, and nobody serious claims that it is. But for a documented population strung along one stretch of the Guerrero coastline, population geneticists say something strange happened between two countries separated by the widest ocean on the planet, and by the end of this video, you will know exactly how a piece of the Philippines ended up woven into Mexico, in town names, in everyday language, in centuries-old religious art, and now, finally, in confirmed DNA. To understand why that signal exists at all, you have to go back to 1565, to a Spanish priest and navigator named Andres de Urdaneta. Spain already controlled Mexico by then, and had just planted its flag in the Philippines, but there was a problem nobody could crack. Sailing west from Mexico to Manila was the easy half, pushed along nicely by the trade winds. Getting a ship back was the trap. Every obvious route east ran straight into headwinds strong enough to strand a galleon for months, or sink it outright, and for decades, Spain simply had no reliable way home from its new Pacific colony. Urdaneta found the fix almost by accident, and it is an understated piece of navigation for the 16th century. Instead of fighting the wind directly, sail north first. Catch the Kuroshio current up near Japan, ride it east across the very top of the Pacific, then let it curl south down the coast of California before dropping into the port of Acapulco. It worked on the first attempt, and once it worked, Spain did not treat it as a lucky one-off. Spain turned it into a permanent machine, and that machine ran, almost without interruption, for the next 250 years. Spain had already bound these two places together tightly on paper, long before a single galleon ever sailed. The Philippines was not governed directly from Madrid. It was administered as a distant province of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, ruled out of Mexico City, thousands of miles closer to Manila than Spain itself ever was. Orders, funding, priests, and soldiers bound for the Philippines routinely passed through Mexico first. On paper, Mexico and the Philippines were not two separate colonies that happened to trade with each other. For roughly 2.5 centuries, one of them technically reported to the other, which makes the later cultural overlap look a lot less like coincidence and a lot more like the obvious outcome of how the empire was organized. Historians call the result the Manila Galleon Trade, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it stands as one of the first true global supply chains in recorded history. Galleons loaded with luxury goods from across Asia left Manila every year, crossed the entire Pacific, unloaded in Acapulco, and sailed home stuffed with Mexican silver bound straight back to Asia. Locals in Acapulco started calling the incoming ship the Nao de China, the China ship, even though it sailed from Manila, because everything it carried had originally come from further west. Goods from that Manila-Acapulco route eventually reached buyers in Europe and China alike, meaning a single Spanish colonial shipping lane linked 3 continents together 200 years before anyone used a phrase like global trade. Historians estimate that at the height of the run, roughly a third of all the silver mined in Spanish America crossed the Pacific through this one route, headed to buy silk and spice in Asia. That is an enormous share of one empire's entire economy riding on a handful of wooden ships a year. None of that cargo sailed itself though, and that is the part the postcard version of this story usually skips. A crew still had to work the rigging through a Pacific storm and cook for men locked on a wooden ship for 5 or 6 straight months, rationing food and fresh water across a crossing longer than almost any other regular sea route on Earth at the time. Somebody also had to keep the hull from rotting apart under a tropical sun, with no dry dock for thousands of miles in any direction, and Spain never had nearly enough Spanish sailors willing to sign up for a voyage carrying that kind of death toll. Below deck, the air stayed thick and foul for months at a stretch, packed with too many men and too little airflow to ever clear. So Spain filled its crews with Filipino labor, and colonial paperwork from the period is blunt about how it viewed them. Records classify these sailors as indios, the exact same label Spanish administrators slapped on indigenous Mexicans, and plenty of the men were not exactly volunteers. A forced labor system called the Polo y Servicio could compel Filipino men into galleon work whether they wanted it or not, and once aboard, they were stuck for the full length of the voyage with no way to leave. Mortality estimates on a single crossing sometimes reach as high as a third of the crew, taken by starvation, scurvy, or shipwreck before the ship ever reached Acapulco. Sailors who lived through it described food gone rotten and water gone foul long before the crossing ended. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire Spanish Empire, nothing close to a pleasure cruise carrying exotic goods, and Filipino labor is the reason it functioned at all for 2.5 centuries straight. The men who survived a crossing did not always turn around and sail home again. Some stayed in Acapulco, some drifted further along the coast, married into local communities, worked trades on land, and simply folded into the population around them the way any immigrant community eventually does. Multiply that pattern across roughly 250 years of continuous voyages, and you get thousands of Filipino sailors, cooks, carpenters, and shipbuilders settling permanently in colonial Mexico. The colonial government even created a distinct legal category for them, labeling anyone arriving from Spain's Asian territories a chino, a catch-all term that still shows up buried in old Mexican church registries and census records if you know where to go looking for it. Somewhere in the province of Pampanga in the Philippines, there is an actual functioning town whose official government-registered name is simply Mexico. It isn't a nickname somebody invented for tourists. Local records place its founding at around 1581 as a river trading port, and historians still debate exactly why the name stuck. Some say Spanish administrators formally named it after Mexico City. Others say it grew out of a native word for a bend in the river that just happened to sound similar, and the Spanish spelling won out either way. What isn't in dispute is that the town has carried some version of that name for centuries, and it still shows up today on any current map or gazetteer of the Philippines, exactly where the records say it should be. Spanish colonizers moved so many people, so much cargo, and so many place names back and forth across that galleon route for 250 straight years, the same route that put Filipino sailors on Mexican soil to stay. Stories like this one tend to stay buried in specialist corners of the internet a general history channel would never check, which is exactly the gap this channel exists to fill. If you want the next one the moment it goes up, instead of finding it 2 years late, staying subscribed here is the only way that reliably happens, since the platform won't surface it on its own. If the sailors and the borrowed town name were the entire story, this would already be an unusual enough piece of history worth knowing on its own. But it goes one layer deeper, because that history left an actual, measurable mark in human DNA, and that mark is the part modern population science can now check directly. A lot of what circulates online about this topic inflates the numbers into something dramatic. The honest, unhedged version holds up fine on its own, without needing a shock statistic attached to it. Researchers studying population genetics along Mexico's Pacific coast, in work published in the journal Science, sampled indigenous and mestizo communities across Guerrero and neighboring Colima, and found something that did not fit the expected picture of purely European and indigenous American ancestry. A subset of individuals carried a genetic signature consistent with Southeast Asian origin, the kind of pattern you would expect to appear if a Southeast Asian population had settled and had children in that exact region generations back. The scale of that pattern is modest. Across the broader sampled population, it typically sits in the low single digits, and in a handful of individual cases concentrated right along that coastline, it climbs noticeably higher, though still nowhere near a population-wide figure. This is not a case of 1 in 4 Mexicans walking around with a hidden Filipino grandparent, and any version of this story that tells you otherwise is exaggerating the science to make a better headline. What the data supports is smaller and honestly more interesting than the inflated version. A genuine, regionally concentrated genetic trace, sitting exactly where 250 years of documented history says it should sit, in exactly the coastal communities the galleon route touched directly. That kind of tight geographic match is exactly what you would expect from an authentic historical migration, not from statistical noise or coincidence. Stack that finding next to everything already on the table, the shipping records classifying Filipino crews as indios, the forced labor system that put them aboard, the settlement pattern along the coast, and the borrowed town name sitting on a Philippine map to this day, and the DNA result stops looking like an isolated curiosity. It looks like the last confirming piece of a pattern historians had already reconstructed from paper records alone. Genetics did not discover this story. Genetics confirmed a story the shipping manifests had already been telling for centuries, which is the more surprising version of events, because it means the paperwork was right the whole time and nobody thought to check it against a lab result until fairly recently. If you are watching this and you happen to have family from that stretch of the Guerrero or Colima coastline, this is probably the point where you start mentally running through old family photos, looking for a face that suddenly makes a lot more sense. And that reaction alone tells you why a quiet, hedged finding like this one still manages to spread faster than most flashy statistics ever do. A small regional signal like this does not erase or compete with the far larger, well-documented indigenous and European ancestry that defines most of Mexico, and it is worth saying that plainly. It sits alongside that picture as one narrow thread woven into a small set of coastal communities, not a replacement for anything else those communities already know about their own roots. A trade route that moved people for 250 years also moved culture, not just DNA, and some of what it carried is still performed, spoken, and displayed today on both sides of the Pacific. Every year on that same Guerrero coast, residents put on a costumed folk dance passed down since colonial times, a mock battle between two costumed sides acting out an old Spanish story of conflict between Christian and Muslim forces, known locally as Los Moros y Cristianos, Moors and Christians. Spanish missionaries exported that same mock battle festival template across their empire, and costumed folk performances built on it still survive in Philippine town fiestas today under their own local names. Nobody is claiming one festival caused the other. What both sides share is a colonial Spanish performance tradition, carried on the same ships, planted independently in two different soils, and still alive 4 centuries later on opposite sides of an ocean whose populations have mostly never met, still stepping through the same borrowed choreography without knowing where it came from. Language carried pieces of the same exchange, and this direction of the story tends to surprise people because it runs backward from what they expect. In the Philippines today, the everyday word for an open-air market or bazaar is tiangue. That word is not Spanish, and it is not native Tagalog. It comes from the Nahuatl word tianguis, the Aztec term for a marketplace, carried across the Pacific by Spain's colonial administrators, along with everything else those galleons hauled. So, while Filipino sailors were settling into Mexico's coastline, an Aztec word for market was working its way into Filipino vocabulary, and Filipinos have used it constantly ever since, most of them with no idea an Aztec emperor's subjects coined the original term. Linguists have found other loanwords riding the same current, smaller than tiangue and less headline-friendly, but the pattern holds. A colonial trade route did not just move silk and silver back and forth, it rewired everyday vocabulary on both ends of the crossing, without anyone noticing, until someone finally sat down and traced the words back to their source. Objects made the crossing too, and some of the strangest survivors sit in museum collections in Mexico right now, waiting for anyone to look closely enough to notice them. Colonial-era ivory sculptures called santos, devotional figures of Christ and various saints, were carved in workshops in Manila using imported elephant ivory, then shipped across on the galleons for churches in New Spain that needed religious art and had no local supply of it. Look closely at some of these figures in Mexican colonial art collections today, and the faces do not read as European. They read as Asian, because the artisans carving them in Manila were Filipino and Chinese craftsmen working side by side, producing Catholic devotional art in a distinctly Manila style for a congregation on the opposite side of the planet. Christ figures carved with Asian facial features were made for Mexican churches roughly 300 years ago. A museum in the city of Puebla, the Amparo Museum, holds pieces exactly like this in its colonial art collection today, part of the same colonial art history anyone can go study for themselves. Art historians still debate exactly which hand carved which individual piece, Filipino or Chinese, but nobody disputes where the ivory itself traveled from, or how far it had to go to end up hanging on a church wall in central Mexico. Stand in front of one long enough and the cross-cultural math becomes obvious. Christian iconography, carved by Asian hands, shipped across the largest ocean on the planet, and worshipped in Mexico for 3 centuries without most parishioners ever asking why the face looked the way it did. For a connection this deep, Mexico and the Philippines talk about it surprisingly little, and that silence did not happen by accident. Picture a Spanish clerk in a colonial port office, quill in hand, filling out a ship's crew roster. He does not write Filipino, he writes chino, the same word he uses for a Chinese silk merchant on the same dock, and sometimes for an indigenous Mexican standing 3 lines down the same page. One label covering 3 different ancestries, recorded by a clerk who was not especially interested in the difference. Multiply that same small act of carelessness across 100 ports and 2.5 centuries of paperwork, and an entire population effectively disappears into a filing category nobody bothered to sort out. That vagueness was not sloppy bookkeeping. It made an entire workforce easier to administer, easier to leave out of the official memory of the empire, and easier to fold into the general population without ever writing down where their labor or their children had come from. When independence finally arrived for both Mexico and the Philippines in the 19th century, each country built its new national identity around the fight against Spain, not around the overlooked thread Spain's own paperwork had stitched between them. Two countries with more shared history than almost any other pairing on the planet grew up on opposite sides of an ocean and never once compared notes, taught in separate classrooms, filed under separate chapters, in textbooks that never cross-referenced each other. That gap is not permanent, and it has been closing, slowly, in small but concrete ways. Cultural festivals now mark the anniversary of the galleon crossings, sometimes called Galleon Days, pulling academics and descendants from both countries together to trace family lines back voyage by voyage. Consumer genetic testing occasionally does the same job by accident. A customer in a coastal Mexican state opens a results page expecting European and indigenous ancestry, sees a small Filipino or Southeast Asian marker sitting where it should not be, assumes the lab made a mistake, and slowly works out, after a few days of Googling, that the mistake is 400 years old, and nobody in the family ever mentioned it because nobody in the family ever knew. A Mexican travel creator who visited the Philippines earlier this year summed up the whole relationship about as plainly as it can be said, filming locals and Mexicans reacting to how closely the two cultures overlap in food, family structure, and even a shared sense of humor, describing the two countries, in his own words, as families separated by an ocean. The comment section under that clip reads less like strangers discovering a curiosity and more like two branches of the same extended family comparing notes after 400 years apart. Filipino viewers and Mexican viewers going back and forth pointing out identical wedding customs, nearly identical slang, and grandparents on both sides who somehow raised their kids the exact same way without ever meeting. So put every piece back on the table at once. A town named Mexico sitting inside the Philippine countryside. An Aztec word for market still spoken every single day in a Manila neighborhood. Ivory saints with Filipino faces standing inside Mexican churches for 3 centuries. And now a confirmed measured genetic signal in coastal Guerrero and Colima families, sitting exactly where 250 years of shipping records said a signal like that should turn up. None of that is one coincidence stacked on top of another. Each piece checks against the next, one confirming what the last one already implied. It is the leftover wiring of a single trade route that ran for 2.5 centuries. That route carried people, language, and art in both directions, and now the DNA record backs up what the paperwork was already suggesting. A small farming town's official name in the Philippines and a genetic signal from families along that same Guerrero coastline point at the exact same history, 4 centuries and 9,000 miles apart, a connection most people have simply never heard about. Most of the men who made that crossing never imagined their names would be scrubbed out of a history their own descendants grew up never hearing about at school. The ocean did not divide Mexico and the Philippines nearly as cleanly as the map likes to pretend, and knowing what really crossed it, sailors, silver, saints, and eventually DNA, changes how both countries might read their own reflection the next time they look at each other across the water. 9,000 miles apart on paper, and a lot closer than either country was ever taught to believe.